Snarr is not a common name. Family history records trace the name through England, with roots connected to Scandinavia and the Viking Age. The surname Snarr is derived from the Old Norse word snarr, meaning swift, bold, or keen. It was originally used as a nickname for a quick or fast-moving person. The Norse people were Scandinavian seafarers from the lands now known as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. In earlier times, many of these people were known as Vikings. From roughly 793 to 1066, the Vikings raided, traded, explored, and colonized across Europe, Asia, and the North Atlantic. They became famous for their longboats, which allowed them to cross seas, travel rivers, attack quickly, and leave just as quickly. The northern coast of England was close across the North Sea, making it an easy target for Viking raids. Over time, many Vikings stayed, intermarried, raised families, and became part of English life. The city of York, in northeast England, became one of the important places where this Viking influence could be seen. Centuries later, discoveries in York uncovered many Viking artifacts and helped show how deeply the Norse people had shaped that region. Near this part of England, the Snarr family story continued. James Thomas Snarr was born on November 7, 1818, at Hull, Yorkshire, England. Hull was not far from York and sat close to the sea. Harriet Brough was born in Lincolnshire, also in eastern England. Before they became pioneers in Utah, James and Harriet were a young English couple with deep roots in a land shaped by centuries of history. James Thomas Snarr and Harriet Brough were married on November 5, 1841. James was about 23 years old. Harriet was about 18. 4 children were born to the family while they were living in England, though one died before they left for America. 6 more children would be born after they left England. Harriet was remembered as a tiny woman with snappy dark eyes and a cleft in her chin, a distinguishing feature passed down to many of her descendants. She was quick in her movements, quick as a wink, and family stories also remember that she was tone-deaf and could not carry a tune. James came from humbler circumstances. His father was a baker and could not read or write, signing his name with an X. James received only a modest education and went to work young to help the family survive. As a young man, he worked as a seaman on ships out of Hull, Leeds, and other nearby places with access to the sea. He was described as not very tall, with steel blue eyes and an abundance of brown wavy hair. As a seaman, his arms were tattooed above the wrists. James also had a knack for working with food. Like his father, he became a cook and baker, working on passenger and merchant ships. Those skills would later help him build a life in Utah. During this period, most ships were wind-powered vessels, often with 3 masts to carry their sails. On one voyage, James met men who were traveling to England to serve as missionaries for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. While on board the ship, they taught him about the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. James accepted their message and was baptized on November 22, 1852. When he returned to England, he excitedly told Harriet about his conversion. Harriet was taught the gospel and joined the church on December 14, 1852. At that time, members of the church were encouraged to gather to Zion to help build up the church and continue in their faith. For James and Harriet, Zion meant Salt Lake City, Utah, in the deserts of the Rocky Mountains, in the United States of America. It was a long way from England, but James and Harriet decided to go. James and Harriet booked passage for America aboard the ship Windermere. They sailed from Liverpool, England, to New Orleans, Louisiana, on February 22, 1854. Traveling with them were their 3 children. Also in the company were Harriet's brother, John Brough, his wife Mary, and their young son. There were 477 converts on the ship, most from England and some from Germany. As the ship prepared to leave the harbor, many sang the songs of Zion. Friends and family stood on shore to say goodbye. Then the Windermere left England behind. The accommodations on the ship were cramped and squalid. Soon after leaving the harbor, the seas became rough, and many passengers became seasick. Their journey to Zion had begun, but it would become much harder than they imagined. As the Windermere crossed the sea, storms began to trouble the ship. At one point, the ship was thrown off course toward a dangerous area. They passed near places known for shipwrecks, and on the morning after leaving, the body of a passenger who had died during the night was committed to the sea. The ship also passed the remains of a wrecked vessel, masts, sails, and fragments floating in the water. Then, on March the 12th, a fierce storm began. The storm tossed the ship and passengers around. Sails were torn apart. In the hold, ropes holding provisions broke, and supplies pitched back and forth as the ship rolled from side to side. The captain feared the ship might not survive. He asked the saints to pray, saying he had done all he could for the ship, and if there was a God, they had better speak to him. The saints began to pray. James was asked to offer one of the prayers. Family tradition remembers that he commanded the winds to be still. Later, when speaking of that experience, James said, "God is on the water as well as on the land." But the storm was not the end of their suffering. A few days later, smallpox broke out. Many became sick, some recovered, but others died and were buried at sea. Then a fire broke out in the cooking galley, and passengers formed bucket brigades to put it out. Still, the Windermere continued. After weeks of hardship, the weather became more pleasant, and the ship began to make better progress. The Windermere had been at sea for more than 8 weeks. Then, on April 8th, a shout went up. Land ahead. They had reached New Orleans. New Orleans was not the end of the journey. From there, the saints traveled up the Mississippi River to St. Louis, Missouri by river steamboat. This part of the journey took 1 to 2 weeks. Along the way, passengers sometimes had to stop in towns because of cholera outbreaks. In St. Louis, they transferred to smaller riverboats and traveled up the Missouri River, across Missouri toward Kansas City. There, they were outfitted for the trek to Salt Lake City. The journey now changed from water to land. They had crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Now they would cross the plains. The saints came west in covered wagons, but many walked most of the way to save wear and tear on the oxen or horses that carried the load. For Harriet, this part of the journey became especially difficult. Harriet was pregnant as they entered this part of the journey. The bouncing of the wagon was uncomfortable, so she walked most of the way. On September 11th, 1854, the company stopped near Green River, Wyoming. There, in the encampment, Harriet gave birth to a baby son. After a few days of rest, they resumed their journey to Salt Lake City. Harriet continued walking much of the way. It is easy to speak of pioneers in large numbers, companies, wagons, immigrants, saints. But Harriet's story brings the journey down to a personal level. A mother, a child, a trail, a few days of rest, then onward again. Their arrival in Salt Lake City came around October 1st, 1854. The church welcomed the newly arrived saints and helped them get settled, especially with winter coming soon. James had been a sailor. Now he was living in a dry desert environment and had to find a way to provide for his family. James and Harriet were assigned to help the Wells family, who lived on the southeast corner of South Temple and Main Street, a place that later became the Hotel Utah and is now the Joseph Smith Memorial Building. Daniel H. Wells was an apostle of the church and a counselor to Brigham Young. Because Elder Wells was away much of the time, James was placed in charge of the commissary storeroom, or train, as it was called. James also worked in the tithing office. In those days, tithing did not involve only money. It included livestock, produce, and other goods people had produced. These items were then distributed or sold to help support the church. Even in these early years, James's baking skills were remembered. Annie Wells Cannon later recalled that she looked forward to Jimmy cooking cherry pies because he made the best pie crust in the valley. The sailor and baker from England had found a way to serve and provide in the Salt Lake Valley. James and Harriet bought or built a little adobe house at 326 West 6th South in Salt Lake City. This location is now near the off-ramp of Interstate 15, one of the busiest areas in the valley. Over the years, James and Harriet acquired more parcels of land near their home on 6th South. On February 11, 1873, James bought a 30-acre farm with an additional 50 acres of pasture in Murray, near the Jordan River. As various family members lived on and managed the farm, this area became known as Snarrville. James also established a general store, selling food, meats, supplies, and baked goods in a building next to his home. Harriet worked in the store, tended to customers, and helped with the accounts and books. She was friendly and outgoing. James was quiet and reserved. Harriet was known to be meticulously clean and tidy. James was known for his baking skills. On Sunday mornings, James served in the 6th Ward Sunday School presidency and would be in church much of the morning. Harriet would go to the store, lock the doors, and scrub the place thoroughly. Sometimes she was chided for breaking the Sabbath, but she would reply, "Cleanliness is next to godliness." Together, James and Harriet ran their little store and built a good reputation for providing good products. They used produce from their farm in the store and churned their own butter. James mixed his bread every night and began baking it at 3 o'clock in the morning in a wood-burning stove in his home next door. Annie Wells Cannon later stated that James and Harriet ran one of the first bakeries in the Salt Lake Valley. Later in life, James and Harriet made a trip back to England to visit and help convert family members they had left behind. 2 of Harriet's sisters were converted and emigrated to Utah. Their original journey from England to Salt Lake City had taken approximately 8 grueling months. Their later trip back to England took only a couple of weeks and was made with much greater comfort. It is amazing to think of the changes that occurred within their lifetimes. James and Harriet had begun life in England. They crossed the ocean on the Windermere. They endured storm, sickness, death, and fire at sea. They traveled by riverboat, crossed the plains, entered the Salt Lake Valley, built a home, raised a family, ran a store and bakery, and helped establish a community remembered as Snarrville. Their legacy lives on in the generations who came after them.